Grandpa never called any of this survival. As far as he was concerned, it was just common sense. Just things people knew because, at one point or another, they had no choice but to know them. How to find your way home when the fog rolled in. How to start a fire after 3 days of rain. How to tell that bad weather was coming hours before the first drop ever hit the ground. Here's the strange part. Number 7 involves a tree that could save your life in winter. Number 4 is how people kept meat edible for months without electricity. And number 1 wasn't really a survival trick at all. It was the rule that made every other lesson possible. These are the 10 survival techniques Grandpa just thought were common sense. Number 10, reading the sky. Grandpa could look at the sky for 30 seconds and tell you whether rain was coming. He'd notice the clouds dropping lower over the ridgeline. He'd feel the wind suddenly change direction. Sometimes he'd point to a ring around the moon and say, "We'll have rain by morning." The reason is that high, thin clouds often arrive hours before a storm front, while warm, moist air can create halos around the sun and moon. He didn't know the science behind it. He just knew that when the clouds started stacking up over the mountains and the air suddenly felt heavy, it was time to head home. Back then, there wasn't a weather app in your pocket. If you got caught on the wrong side of the mountain in a storm, you stayed wet, cold, and miserable until morning. People learned to pay attention because nature rarely gave you a second warning. But the sky wasn't the only thing Grandpa watched. Number 9, following water home. When I was a kid, Grandpa always said the same thing. If you're lost, find water. The reason was simple. Creeks run downhill, and downhill eventually leads to roads, farms, or towns. Even if you had no idea where you were, water gave you a direction. Grandpa didn't think of it as survival knowledge. To him, it was common sense. And if water could lead you home, it could also keep you alive. Number 8, finding water in the mountains. Grandpa knew where to look when the streams dried up. Low valleys, the base of hills, places where the ground stayed dark and damp long after the rain had stopped. Sometimes he'd point to a line of trees and say, "There's water over there." And more often than not, he was right. People who lived in the mountains learned quickly that carrying enough water wasn't always possible. Knowing where to find it mattered. But finding water was only half the battle. The real challenge was staying warm. Number 7, the tree that burns in the rain. After 3 days of rain, most wood is useless. Grandpa knew that. That's why he looked for old pine stumps filled with fat wood. Inside those stumps was resin, thick and sticky, that could catch fire even when everything else was soaked. He'd shave off thin curls with his knife and strike a match. Within seconds, there'd be flames. People didn't search for fat wood because it was interesting. They searched for it because being cold in the mountains isn't uncomfortable. It's dangerous, and fire wasn't the only thing families needed before winter arrived. Number 6, splitting wood the right way. Every summer, Grandpa split next winter's firewood, not in autumn, not when the cold weather arrived, months earlier. Freshly cut wood holds moisture, and wet wood burns poorly. So he'd split it, stack it, and let the summer sun do the rest. As a kid, it seemed excessive. As an adult, you realize he wasn't preparing for tomorrow. He was preparing for 6 months from now. And nowhere was planning ahead more important than the next tradition. Number 5, finding your way without a compass. Grandpa rarely carried a compass. He followed ridgelines, creek beds, and landmarks he'd known his entire life. He noticed which side of the mountain the sun disappeared behind and which valley held the morning fog the longest. To him, the mountain wasn't wilderness, it was a map. People didn't survive because they were tougher than everyone else. They survived because they paid attention to details most people never noticed, and those details mattered even more when winter arrived. Number 4, the little building behind the house. Every farm seemed to have one. A smokehouse sitting quietly behind the barn. Inside hung hams, sausages, and strips of meat slowly curing in the smoke. People today think of smoking as flavor. Back then, it meant survival. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly. A smokehouse turned a successful hunt or a slaughtered hog into food that could last for months. It was insurance against a hard winter. But preserving meat wasn't enough. People had to preserve themselves too. Number 3, watching the animals. Grandpa trusted animals more than forecasts. Birds flying low meant rain. Squirrels frantically gathering nuts meant winter was coming. Cattle huddling together often meant bad weather wasn't far behind. Was he always right? Probably not. But when you spend your life outdoors, you begin to notice patterns. You stop seeing animals as background noise and start seeing them as warnings. And perhaps the most important warning of all was knowing when to stop. Number 2, never let darkness catch you. Grandpa had a simple rule. If you think it'll take an hour to get home, leave with 2 hours of daylight left. He'd rather arrive early and sit on the porch than risk walking unfamiliar ground in the dark. The mountains change when the sun disappears. Paths vanish. Temperatures drop. Everything looks different. Getting stranded wasn't usually the result of one big mistake. It was the result of a dozen small ones. And that brings us to the final lesson. Number 1, take only what you need. Grandpa never took more fish than he could eat. He never cut down more trees than he needed. He never hunted simply because he could. The mountain provided food, water, and shelter, but only if you respected it. That's the lesson people forget. Most survival wasn't about building giant fires or wrestling bears. It was about understanding that you were part of something bigger than yourself. Because the people who survived in those mountains weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones who learned to live with the land instead of fighting against it. And maybe that's the real survival skill that disappeared. Not how to start a fire, not how to find water, but how to respect the place that keeps you alive.